Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this timely and important event. If you would, please now turn off your cell phones. My name is Derek Malone France. I am Executive Director of the University Writing Program here at GW. We are very pleased and proud to be hosting this first War Powers debate in partnership with the Miller Center at the University of Virginia and the Cross-Examination Debate Association. And we are honored to be joined this evening by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. I want to thank Governor Gerald Baliles, Director and CEO of the Miller Center and his staff, and also Cross-Examination Debate Association Vice President Paul Mabry. GW Debate is a proud member of CETA. This is their first event of the new academic year, and we are honored that they chose to begin their season here at the George Washington University. This event couldn't have happened without the contributions of the School of Media and Public Affairs, and in particular, I want to thank SMPA Director Frank Sesno for his commitment to building a first-class debate program here. We have seen some pretty amazing developments in debate at GW this last year, and Frank's support has made that possible. I also want to recognize our Director of Debate, Paul Hayes, who has a real vision for GW Debate that connects with the larger academic mission of the university in, I think, powerful and wide-ranging ways. I'd also like to recognize some guests from the French Embassy, French Defense Attaché Brigadier General Bruno Kaitakouli, and French Attaché for University Cooperation, Emilion Benet. I'm pleased to share that the French Embassy and GW will be partnering in the upcoming year on a groundbreaking project, the Lafayette Debates, a series of online debates and multimedia competitions pitting GW students against students from around the world, emphasizing original undergraduate research, cross-cultural learning, and culminating in a national intercollegiate tournament held here on the GW campus. We are honored and excited to be working with the French Embassy on this important project. Finally, I'd like to recognize GW's Dean for Military and Veterans Affairs, retired Vice Admiral Mel Williams, Jr., formerly commander of the U.S. Second Fleet of the Navy. It's been my pleasure and honor to work closely with the Admiral as he engages his new mission here at GW to make us the national model of excellence in the service and support of active military members and veterans. And now I will turn things over to Governor Baliles.
Thank you, Derek, for the kind words, and to your great university for hosting us here tonight. Senator Kaine, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Jerry Baliles, and as you heard, I am the Director and CEO of the University of Virginia's Miller Center. We are delighted to partner with GW's impressive Writing Center and with the Cross-Examination Debate Association, or CETA, one of the nation's leading intercollegiate policy debate organizations, in putting together tonight's event, the first in a series of 4 public debates to take place this fall on a very timely issue, war powers. It has been a pleasure working with CETA in recent weeks on these debates. Especially want to recognize the hard work of my friend CETA Vice President Paul Mabry for his part in making this evening possible. For these, well, I should say, Paul, 1 down, 3 more to go. But for those of you unfamiliar with the work of the Miller Center, we are a nonpartisan institution focused on the presidency, policy, and political history, which works to inform public debate and national decision-making. We are perhaps the leading organization in the country looking to provide historical insights into the policymaking challenges confronting our country. These insights put today's policy debates in perspective, and they point toward a framework for practical, lasting solutions in a time when certainly sound, nonpartisan thinking, grounded in history, is certainly needed. While we strive to stay current in our policy work, even we had no idea how timely tonight's debate would be. As President Obama prepares to speak to the nation tonight about the status of the situation in Syria and the Senate continues to look at this question very closely. Perhaps no issue is in greater need of thoughtful, nonpartisan deliberation than war powers. Like many of today's policy challenges, historical understanding is critical to developing sound solutions. On the issue of war powers, we have more than 200 years of constitutional history at our disposal. Article 1 of the Constitution, as many of you know, states that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Article 2 names the President as Commander-in-Chief. After nearly 200 years of ambiguity, in 1973, the so-called War Powers Resolution was passed in an attempt to clarify the matter and to strictly define the role of each branch of government with regard to matters of war. In broad strokes, that resolution asked that the President report and consult with Congress regularly. It narrowly defines the degree of presidential autonomy. In addition, it provides a theoretical timetable in which Congress can grant authorization. Unfortunately, the generally conceded ineffective and impractical 1973 resolution was hastily written. As a result, the reporting and vague consultation provisions are easily circumnavigated. A president has never filed a report triggering the clock on authorization. Congress has never enforced it, and most legal scholars consider the 1973 resolution to be unconstitutional. So, as we've seen throughout history, such ambiguity can have unforeseen consequences, many of them disastrous. At the Miller Center, we felt this critical governance issue should be clarified. So in the spring of 2007, we impaneled the National War Powers Commission. Commissions, as an important periodic tool of governance, has a long lineage, tracing back to the Roman Republic. They present an opportunity to bring wisdom to bear outside the immediate cry of politics, an opportunity to find consensus drawn from experience and suggest a way forward. The War Powers Commission set out to examine the respective powers of the President and Congress over matters of war, and to identify a practical solution to help future executive and legislative branch leaders deal with the issue. It was co-chaired by two of the nation's most trusted public servants, former Secretaries of State James Baker and the late Warren Christopher. It also included some of our country's most respected leaders in national security policy from both sides of the aisle, including Congressman Lee Hamilton, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and Attorney General Ed Meese. Over 14 months, the Commission met 7 times in full-day sessions, interviewing over 40 witnesses on the respective war powers of the executive and legislative branches. The Commission produced a unanimous report for the President and Congress, calling for a repeal of the War Powers Resolution of 1973. In its place, they proposed the passage of a new law, the War Powers Consultation Act, which is the subject of our debate this evening. Copies of the Commission's report can be found on your seats. The proposed act begins by requiring the President to consult with Congress before ordering troops deployment into a significant area of conflict, armed conflict, that is expected to last a week or thereabouts. Second, leaders from both houses of Congress, as well as specific senior members of key committees, would constitute the Joint Congressional Consultation Committee to meet regularly with the President on matters of war and to receive periodic reports. The draft also requires an up or down vote by Congress within 30 days of a defined military action. Congress, thus, is compelled to do more than just talk or let the President take the situation forward. In the months following the release of the report, Secretaries Baker and Christopher briefed President Obama and testified before the House Foreign Affairs and the Senate Foreign Relations Committees regarding the proposed legislation. The Commission members have continued to make the case to policymakers to the present time. But as we all know, passing legislation through Congress is something of an arduous task. So, replacing the 1973 War Powers Resolution will not be achieved in Congress without leadership and political courage. Thankfully, that leadership can be found today in the United States Senate, and I'm honored to introduce one such leader tonight. Senator Tim Kaine is a principled and unwavering statesman, a close personal friend, and a staunch supporter of some of the Miller Center's work. As you know, Senator Kaine currently represents Virginia in the United States Senate. He previously served as governor of Virginia from 2006 to 2010, and as mayor of Richmond from 1998 to 2001. He also served as chairman of the Democratic National Committee from 2009 to 2011. On a more personal note, I've known the good senator for many years and have followed his career closely, partly because our paths so frequently cross, whether it is at the Miller Center, where he has contributed his expertise to projects underway in higher education, among others, or in the more far-flung reaches of our state. Not only has Senator Kaine shown that there is indeed life after leaving the governor's office, he has taken the mantle of advancing the ideas developed by the National War Powers Commission. He understands that the recommendations made by the War Powers Commission were the result of informed, bipartisan deliberations that can offer a politically viable and constitutionally sound solution to these contentious issues. He has advocated for a defined process through which military actions are commenced, undertaken, and then terminated, as the Commission outlines in its report. Earlier this summer, Senator Kaine stated on the Senate floor, and I quote, "The American public needs to hear a clear dialogue between the two branches justifying decisions about war. When Congress and the President communicate openly and reach consensus, the American public is informed and most likely to support decisions about military action. But where there is no clear process for reaching decisions, public opinion with respect to military action may be divided to the detriment of the troops who fight and making it less likely that government will responsibly budget for the cost of war." End of quote. This is the kind of reasoned, practical thinking we need so desperately in this city today. We're incredibly grateful to Senator Kaine and to Senator John McCain, who has taken a similar stance in favor of the Commission's report, although he is unable to attend tonight. And we thank Senator Kaine for offering some words of welcome before we begin tonight's debate. With that, let me turn the lectern over to him. He's already expressed great enthusiasm to hear a new generation debate this topic, and I will say that I know that he will want us to get on it. So, Senator Kaine, step forward.
Well, good evening. It is a treat to be here, and I want to begin by thanking my good friend Governor Baliles for his leadership of the Miller Center, and for basically he is responsible for me being obsessed about this topic. And in some ways, I wish the timing weren't so propitious, but here we are debating the Miller Center's study of a number of years ago, but on a night when the President will address the nation. Today, I've been in meetings pretty much all day long with Senate colleagues and the President, both open and classified, about the situation in Syria. And while the meetings have been very specific to the Syrian reality and what the United States should do there, underlying all of our discussions is really the issue that is confronted by the Miller Center's excellent report, the allocation of responsibility between a president and Congress on matters of initiation of military action. I first heard about the Miller Center's report from Governor Baliles at the end of my time as governor. He actually came and gave me information about it because they were briefing leaders, including leaders who had connections to the White House
and they thought it might be of interest to me. And when I read the report, I became somewhat obsessed by the basic wisdom of the proposal. This issue of finding a consensus between the legislative and executive branches is not just a matter of constitutional law. As I say when I talk about it, the constitutional allocation of responsibilities is a reflection of a deeper value judgment. And in my view, the value judgment is this: it's not right to ask men and women to go into harm's way on behalf of the nation if there isn't a political consensus supporting the mission that they have to sacrifice for. We've got folks in uniform here who are, I imagine, students both at the Naval Academy, and they may be ROTC students at GW. My oldest son is a GW grad, class of 2012, naval option, naval ROTC Marine option, currently in the basic school at Quantico to become a Marine officer. And so these issues matter to me as a matter of constitutional law and policy, but they matter to me very much as an American, as a Virginian, and as a father. We need in the political class to reach a consensus so that those who we ask to carry the burdens of battle will know that they are supported. And ultimately, that's the value judgment that underlies the constitutional allocation of responsibilities. I'm happy to be here tonight because I'm looking forward to hearing the debaters tackle this topic. Senator John McCain and I announced in July, on the 40th anniversary of the passage of the terribly flawed War Powers Resolution of 1973, we announced in July that we were pulling together a working group of senators. And we are using the Miller Center proposal as our starting point for discussions with senators about how we might take that 1973 Act and dramatically improve it, respecting the constitutional prerogatives of both the executive and legislative branch, but establishing a clear consultative process going forward. None of these issues, Syria or other issues we face today, whether it be Iran or North Korea, none of them are easy. But I think they're made harder because of the fact that we don't have a clear consultative norm that is accepted and that has been accepted. We can fix this in a way that respects the constitutional prerogatives of both branches, but that is more likely to lead to the kind of political consensus that the American public deserves and that our men and women in uniform deserve. I look forward to hearing the debate tonight, and again to Governor Baliles, to CEDA, and to George Washington. Thank you for hosting, and to the debaters, best of luck. I'll be taking notes.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. I don't think any of your comments scooped either debate team's points that they want to make with those insightful remarks tonight. Let's get on with the debate. The resolution that will be debated this evening is as follows. The National War Powers Commission's recommendation for the War Powers Consultation Act should be implemented. On stage with me are 6 teams of debaters from some of our nation's best institutions of higher learning. To my right, students representing George Washington University, the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Mary Washington will argue the affirmative, meaning that they are in favor of turning the proposed War Powers Consultation Act into law. To my left, students representing James Madison University, the U.S. Naval Academy, and Georgetown University will argue against the enactment of the War Powers Consultation Act. Before we begin, let me go through the ground rules. The debate portion will last 60 minutes and will follow the modified long table format, which is designed to encourage constructive discourse, direct clash, and interaction in front of a public audience. Each debater will speak 4 or 5 minutes, depending on the speech, and the order will alternate between the affirmative and negative sides. The first 2 opening statements and the last 2 closing speeches will be 4 minutes each, and the debaters will deliver their arguments uninterrupted. In the speeches between the opening and closing statements, 5 minutes will be allotted. The first and last minute of these speeches are uninterrupted, but during the second and fourth minutes of the speeches, an opposition debater may ask the speaker to yield to a question, and he or she may accept or decline the question. Once the final speech has been completed, we will give the audience the opportunity to interact by asking questions or responding to a point made during the course of the debate. If you would like to ask a question, please line up at the stationary microphone that you will find in the middle aisle. Let me conclude by saying good luck to each of the teams. I commend all of you for the research and preparation you've undertaken to understand this complicated but vitally important constitutional issue and to inform your arguments. I will now turn the stage over to the first two teams making their cases. We have George Washington University arguing the affirmative side and James Madison University on the negative. Katie Stasaski from George Washington will start us off. Katie?
First off, on behalf of all the debaters, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. It's truly an honor. In particular, thank you to everybody who made tonight possible, including Senator Kaine, Governor Baliles, Professor Malone France, Professor Cesno, Professor Mabray, and our coach, Paul Hayes, as well as the University Writing Program, the School of Media and Public Affairs, the Miller Center, and CETA. As Joseph and I were preparing for today's debate, we realized something. That neither of us knows anything but war, and at the same time, neither of us knows anything about war. You see, we were in the second grade on the day that the towers fell. I was in math class when my teacher told us what had happened with a look on her face that I had never seen before. I'm sure that everybody here remembers where they were at that moment, but I'm not sure everybody knows how formative that experience was for my generation. You see, since September 11th, which tomorrow we will celebrate the 12th anniversary of 9/11, since then, the United States has been involved in conflict with Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. That's what I mean when I say that Joseph and I have known nothing but war for most of our lives. At the same time, I don't really know war. I know that I can never repay the incredible sacrifices made by our troops and their families. I know that it's hard for our government to know when war will be effective, to know when a regime that we are supporting will be any better than the regime they are replacing. But that doesn't mean that I know war. Like many, for most of the big things going on in my life, I can't tell you what I would be doing differently if we weren't at war. And that's the mindset that we should evaluate tonight's topic, with an awareness that we live in a world in which war is so common that it doesn't seem radical or shocking. In a world in which the great sacrifices of war are borne by a minority of our country, as well as innocents half a world away, many of whom are out of sight and out of mind. In such a world, it is essential that our leaders develop a pragmatic process for the declaration of war. Because when war is not just a question of great national sacrifice and is instead a nuanced policy option to which many aren't even paying attention, we are more dependent than ever on our leaders to wield American power justly, effectively, and responsibly. As a matter of theory, many would argue that the US Constitution gives only Congress the right to declare war. But as a matter of practice, Congress didn't declare war in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya. And the courts are reluctant to get involved in the issue, leaving it up to Congress to assert their own powers. Accordingly, Joseph and I stand resolved that the National War Powers Commission recommendation for the War Powers Consultation Act should be implemented. The Consultation Act is the work of the Miller Center's bipartisan National War Powers Commission. As an aside, we're proud to note that at least two of the commission's members, Warren Christopher and Edwin Meese, were former collegiate debaters. The Consultation Act, 1, provides that the president shall consult with Congress before deploying troops into significant armed conflict. 2, creates a congressional consultation committee which includes leaders of both houses. 3, establishes a bipartisan staff to assist Congress in analyzing intelligence information. And 4, calls on Congress to vote on a resolution of approval within 30 days. Unlike the existing War Powers Act of 1973, the Consultation Act doesn't attempt to resolve disputes between Congress and the president over the use of presidential powers. Instead, it provides a framework with which some of these disputes can be negotiated and promotes congressional accountability. In conclusion, no solution is perfect, but it is what the American people want when their leaders confront the serious questions of war and peace.
Thank you, Katie. Samantha Perez from James Madison will deliver the first speech for the negative side.
I too remember the falling of the towers 12 years ago. I grew up in Haymarket, Virginia, a DC suburb. I remember sitting in my 3rd grade class, hearing the principal announce that a plane had hit the Pentagon. I was too young to really understand what it meant, but I knew enough to be scared for the well-being of my 3rd grade classmates and their parents, as one by one, my classmates were being picked up early. I also knew too little to predict that the ensuing war would result in my brother, an EOD specialist in the Army, receiving a notice for deployment in the same conflict over a decade later. However, while war remains a reality for us, we disagree with our opponents because we believe that our current experiences should not overdetermine our understanding of presidential war powers authority. Thus, we are resolved that the War Powers Consultation Act should not be implemented. Not only does it not resolve the problems in political decision-making that my opponents have discussed, but it places dangerous statutory restrictions on the executive flexibility to address the ever-changing nature of war. First, I will begin by addressing my opponent's arguments. Contrary to the intent of the piece of legislation, mandating joint committee consultation on a regular basis will not resolve the problems of Congress's failure to assert their authority in declaring war. The problem is politics, not the law. Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU, Richard Plides, argues that statutory restrictions on the president are largely ineffective. Even when Congress has the ability to utilize laws such as the War Powers Resolution, they refuse to do so. Despite Congress being well-informed or the president being forced to submit reports, Robert McMahon on the Council for Foreign Relations notes that only 1 of 132 reports submitted have resulted in Congress appealing to restrictions established by the War Powers Resolution. Dr. Plides also notes that even when Congress does impose legislative constraints, the laws are typically vague, leaving ample room for executive discretion. The War Powers Consultation Act is no exception. According to Section 3B of the statute, the president is allowed to introduce armed forces without consultation of the Joint Committee in instances that aren't considered a significant armed conflict, which includes the following exceptions: actions taken to repel attacks or to prevent attacks on the U.S., its territories, embassies, consulates, or armed forces abroad, limited acts of reprisal against terrorists or states that sponsor terrorism, and investigations or acts to prevent criminal activity abroad. This means that every action the affirmative will cite as failures in the decision-making process is exempt from the consultation process, including the deployment of troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and even Syria. The statute lacks any kind of force. Mandated consultation will not translate into significant altercation of the war powers decision-making. As Eric Posner, distinguished professor of law at the University of Chicago, notes when discussing the War Powers Consultation Act, that presidents will continue to inform, not consult, Congress will continue to try to persuade the courts to intervene, and the courts will continue to refuse to get involved. Congress has always had the option to block spending, but they almost never use it. My opponents mentioned that while they respect the sacrifices made by the members of the armed forces, they really don't understand the concept of what war is today in our current geopolitical climate. This is a key reason as to why the president is meant to have such a heavy hand in war powers. Many of us, even some members of Congress, don't understand the sacrifices needed or have the political will to make the sacrifices that will protect our nation's security, to protect the life that our founding fathers have intended for us to have, the life that continues to let us live as if things are business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Now we will hear from Joseph Nelson of George Washington University for the second affirmative speech. Please remember, from now until the closing speeches, any opposition debater may ask the speaker to yield to a question between the second and fourth minutes of their speech. Joseph?
First, I'd like to commend Samantha's brother, as well as all armed service men and women, before beginning my speech. Our opponents' arguments reside on a couple of claims that are problematic. The War Powers Consultation Act, and I wrote their quote, as they say, will not resolve the problems of Congress's failure to exert their authority in declaring war, unquote. The negative's claims and three arguments all rest in the contention and are, for the most part, the same, that the problem is politics and not law. That's a critical distinction. The Congress, whether they want to or not, it is their job to enforce the statutes. But if they do so, and if Congress is going to be ignored by the president, no form of constitution, no legal statute can change that. Thus, we must look at what happens if we pass an act should the president choose to engage and consult Congress. Indeed, the War Powers Consultation Act informs Congress in a way that makes consultation far more productive. The Consultation Act doesn't make the problem any worse, furthermore. The act may be ineffective in such circumstances, but that doesn't mean that the Congress cannot be involved in congressional approval before going to war. After all, that is what President Obama is doing in the case of Syria. As reported in the New York Times, Catherine Rommler, a White House counsel, recently said, quote, "The president believed that it was important to enhance the legitimacy of any action that would be taken by the executive. To seek congressional approval of that action would have it seen again as a matter of legitimacy, both domestically and internationally, that there was a unified American response to the horrendous violation of international norm against chemical weapon use." And while Obama did not rule out acting without Congress, the lack of political cover at least creates political incentives that might have an impact on the process. Indeed, the current Syria debate proves that Congress has prerogative, initiative, and drive to be involved in the decision-making process. Further, it is somewhat cynical of the negative to assume they will never have courageous congressmen and women. The status quo proves that they do want to be involved in the process. The purpose of the Consultation Act is to address such situations. To assure the president seeking the political cover of consultation can't cherry-pick members of Congress with which they want to consult. Recall, the act requires that they consult with a bipartisan body. That means that the consultation cannot just be simply the president reaffirming his will. The best decisions are therefore made. Additionally, the Consultations Act guarantees that the bipartisan staff dedicated to helping Congress organize, collect, analyze the relevant intelligence so as to increase the odds that the Congress makes the best decision possible. My opponent has a question.
Why would it be preferable to have consultation when within 30 days it might be beneficial for an individual with a quick decision?
Even if it's true that an individual can have a quick decision, I think you're missing the point that the War Powers Consultation Act includes a clause about imminent threat. The first negative speaker even named a number of areas where Congress is not required to be consulted before intervening. That's a critical distinction. If there's an imminent threat, the president can act to prevent that imminent threat. A distinction would be a case like Syria. There is arguably not imminent threat, which means Congress should be involved in the decision-making process. Indeed, the status quo proves that is the case. That is the way it should be. Furthermore, the negative seems to assume the only purpose of the Consultations Act is to restrain the president. Another important function of the act is to assure congressional accountability. They didn't touch on this point. There may be times when Congress is reluctant to take a position, thus emboldening our enemies to keep fighting in the hopes that our political will falters. That is indeed what the quote that I read above from White House counsel reaffirms. Finally, the negative argues that any restrictions on the war powers of the president would result in a national security threat. That is incorrect. As I answer this question, imminent threat is a critical distinction. So, in conclusion, nothing about the Consultation Act precludes Congress from exercising its constitutional powers should they ever develop the political will. I look forward to that day. Second, the negatives arguments apply far more to the existing War Powers Resolution, Recall that in the status quo, the president doesn't necessarily have to consult. Our introduction proved that many view the War Powers Resolution as unconstitutional, meaning that the consultation that occurs is not required. It does not even mean that it has to happen with a bipartisan committee. We should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If Congress comes up with a pragmatic solution that is a step in the right direction, Congress should embrace this, and the president should also yield to it in times of war powers. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Delivering the second negative speech from James Madison University is Jacob Bosley.
Even if we as a nation come to the conclusion that reform is needed in the exercise of presidential and congressional war powers, this is not the law that will bring about that change. The current situation in Syria will provide a crucial frame to understand why the War Powers Consultation Act would not produce the desired dialogue and improvements in political decision-making allotted by my opponents. First, as we've already stated, politics is the problem, not the law. As my partner explained, Congress has consistently sought to avoid acting upon authority that is already granted by the law, including the War Powers Resolution, which includes actions such as acting upon information that has been provided to the president, provided to Congress 132 times, which would be, as our Posner evidence indicates, the same problems we're already facing. The information that is required, i.e. consultation, will simply be an empty gesture that does not actually provide Congress the information needed to craft effective decisions if Congress were to act upon it at all. In addition, inevitably, those in Congress would posture them against whatever decision is reached, which means that the accountability that my opponents have mentioned would not come into effect. Second, the bill has inevitable loopholes. Exempt from mandatory JCC consultation are actions that result from significant armed conflict would include things such as commitment of U.S. armed forces by the president to repel attacks, prevent imminent attacks in the United States, territorial possessions, its embassies, armed forces, acts to prevent criminal activity ahead, covert operations, and limited acts of reprisal against terrorists or states that sponsor terrorism. This means that almost every action that we have seen as a problematic use of war powers, including Syria and Libya and Bosnia, would all fall under these kinds of definitions. For example, in the Syria situation, given that there's a stockpile of chemical weapons, one could make the argument that given that those stockpiles could be taken over by groups that have explicit interest in acquiring these weapons and attacking the United States, that there is incentive for the president to act without consultation. Yes?
You criticize the consultation process as an empty gesture, yet because President Obama has decided to consult and allow Congress to authorize war, we now have Syria giving up its chemical weapons to Russia. So doesn't that prove that consultation and deliberation allows for more foreign policy options?
That's a good question. We would have two responses. First, the decisions that have already arisen from other countries, for example, France and Russia both having proposed policies for the turnover of chemical weapons to the United Nations, came about as a result of the threat of the heavy hand of the United States. If that threat was not there, there would not be a time pressure for international responses to ensure that they have those, particular responses, which means that delay from result of consultation is not necessary. Second, the problem is that there's no mechanism to make sure that that delay translates into effective actions after the fact, which I will get to in a second. As my partner already mentioned, there's a question of a lack of force. The legislation indicates that in anything that is not counted as a significant armed conflict, anything that is counted as significant armed conflict with the exception of the exemptions I just listed above, that ultimately what happens is that Congress would give their opinions, their disapproval. They'd be forced to vote on the law they'd be forced to vote upon an authorization of the use of force in 30 days. But even if they did not vote on that, there then has to be a second vote about whether or not that there's a law to disapprove of that. Even if that law gets passed, that would go to the president, which the president can then veto that law, which then means that it would have to go back to Congress to have an inevitable vote where it takes a substantial amount of political will to have the 2/3 necessary to overcome the presidential veto. Long story short, even if Congress were to act upon the information provided, it's very unlikely that that would alter presidential decision-making in any effective manner. More importantly, there's a question of political will. As Governor Baliles has already mentioned, it is difficult to pass legislation. It is difficult to get the bipartisan consensus, even if we are managing to create a committee to review these decisions, which means that given that this law does not have an effective check on presidential war powers authority, it makes it extremely unlikely that anytime soon we will have the political will necessary to vote on reform in order to deal with these problems in a substantive manner that has a law with teeth, which means that all that's provided is a mask that gives presidential legitimacy, because at least the president can say, I talked to Congress, which gets the public behind them. But that's not a reason why it actually alters or improves the decision-making process before we have the use of force. Thus, this bill will not solve the problem. It only ensures we delay actual solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. The next team of debaters squaring off represent the University of Pittsburgh and the U.S. Naval Academy. Chris Solis of Pitt will argue for the affirmative.
The war powers of the executive have snowballed out of control. The containment strategies of the Cold War and the imperial presidency of the post-9/11 era have created a climate in which the president may engage in nearly any military endeavor without the consent of Congress. Worse is the fact that many of these military expeditions last months or even years, and for all intensive purposes constitute wars, even absent their declaration by Congress. The court is unable to act to clarify the meaning of the War Powers Clause of the Constitution, and the only legislation in effect, the War Powers Resolution of 1973, was ill-conceived then, but has become even more impotent given the advent of new military technologies. As Joseph said, we cannot afford to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Thus, we stand resolved that the National War Powers Commission recommendation for the War Powers Consultation Act should be implemented for 3 reasons. First, constitutionality. Second, procedural clarity. And third, from the inherent benefits of consultation. The first advantage is passage of the War Powers Consultation Act is constitutionality. It explicitly states that it doesn't intend to expand the power of the president or constrain the power of Congress or vice versa. It's in line with the Constitution and repeals the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which may or may not contain unconstitutional elements. Also, the Campbell versus Clinton decision rendered in the year 2000, the majority decision claimed that it has been held that the statutory threshold standard is not precise enough and too obviously calls for a political judgment to be suitable for judicial determinations. They claim the courts won't act, and they're correct. It's a political issue, which is exactly why we must legislate it out of existence. The second advantage is procedural clarity. Loopholes are rampant in the 1973 War Powers Resolution. First of all, the War Powers Consultation Act is superior because it defines significant armed conflict, whereas the War Powers Resolution of 1973 neglects to define the term hostilities. This allowed President Obama to enter into a war with Libya on March 19th of 2011 without the approval of Congress. It also doesn't hamper covert action, training, or retaliation. Our opponents will make attempts to claim that we are somehow hindering the power of Congress by passing the WPCA, when in reality, all time-sensitive issues, responses to terrorist threats or imminent attacks on the United States, will remain intact. The third advantage, the third advantage is the benefit of consultation. There is a distinction between notification and consultation. The legislation explicitly says there must be time for a timely exchange of views. Yes, I'll take your question. Thank you.
You claim this statute avoids loopholes. How can you claim that with the vague exceptions in Section 3B, which could justify the invasions in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan?
It certainly would not justify the invasion of Libya because the attack on the embassy didn't come until about 5 months after. We had already gone into Libya, for example. Also, there was no imminent threat from Iraq or from Afghanistan, and all of those instances are instances in which we would be there for more than a week, which is the minimum of what Section 3B terms a significant armed conflict because it lasts more than a week. All of those were expected to last for more than a week. This new legislation will resolve all of those issues. Also, The benefits of consultation also include slowing down some of these decisions. One of the questions fielded earlier was, well, won't it impede our ability to make quick decisions? In instances when quick decisions are necessary, such as responding to strikes, that will be possible. That is still, that power exists still. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Also, I'd like to address some of the specific points that my opponents made. First, if the problem is politics and not law, we should legislate the problem out of existence. They claim that status quo statutes are ineffective, and we agree. That was the line that I read from the majority decision in the Campbell versus Clinton. Second, even if loopholes are inevitable, look to countless examples of the use of these loopholes, which would be closed by the WPCA. Reducing the number of loopholes is key. The question of defining hostilities is the most important. Lastly, they claim that the statute lacks any force of will. And they say that the president will only inform, but the legislation mandates real consultation, as I stated above, a timely allotment of time to exchange views. Military power is an indispensable component of American politics and no longer be allowed to linger in uncertainty. With the Syria crisis at hand and systemic irresolution regarding military action persisting, we must act to pass the War Powers Consultation Act of 2009. It is in line with the Constitution of our great nation. It provides much-needed procedural clarity, which eliminates ambiguity, and it provides intrinsic benefits of consultation. We cannot afford to wait any longer.
Thank you, Chris. Arguing in opposition to the resolution from the U.S. Naval Academy is Midshipman Natasha Jamordi Connor.
As you can imagine, the topic we're debating tonight means a lot to us based on a personal and a professional level. We would like to note that all arguments made tonight do not represent the Department of Defense, the United States military, or the Naval Academy. While the spirit of the proposals outlined in the Commission's report are good, the proposals would result in significant problems for military execution. Specifically, we commend the authors of the report for their commitment to the principle of public debate, which is critical to understanding of military actions and to the American spirit of democracy. However, we believe that granting the president broad powers, generally unrestricted by Congress, is necessary to protect lives, promote critical national interests, and achieve the goals of the particular intervention being contemplated. We were recently presented with a hypothetical situation. Imagine that, acting under the parameters of the War Powers Consultation Act, Congress authorizes a limited strike against Syria, and in response, Syria launches missiles against Israel and kills large numbers of Israeli civilians. In response, within 3 hours, Israel launches airstrikes, and Syria shoots down and captures an Israeli pilot, who is now being detained. Must the president return to Congress to get authorization to aid Israel in getting their pilot back? If so, would Congress have 30 days to vote up or down on such an issue? Yeah, I'll take your question.
Thank you. The new Consultation Act actually includes an exception where the president could take immediate action as long as he consults Congress in 3 days, within 3 days of the action being taken. Wouldn't this solve for your hypothetical scenario?
No, because there are certain events that take place sooner than 3 days. 3 days? In 3 days, people would die. The lives of Americans, they would die. Our plan that keeping the status quo ensures that the president has powers to keep the interests of America. For example, the kidnapping of Jessica Buchanan. If we were to wait for Congress to argue it out within 3 days, she would be dead. We no longer have the luxury wars that can be conducted slowly, with great deliberation taking place before every new step. This is because of improvements in intelligence gathering and dissemination, not just by us, but also by our strategic competitors and non-allies. Much of this intelligence is instantly accessible by media, which means that It is also accessible by those who have access to media, including our enemies in the contemplated conflict. Debates that take place in Congress on the questions of Syria are surely being closely watched by the Syrian government. Finally, military technology is such that retaliation can be exacted within minutes of an attack, including retaliation against unarmed civilians in America or one of our allies, which requires instantaneous response. Yes?
Your argument about presidential flexibility assumes that the president always makes good decisions. History over and over again disproves this. Why wouldn't deliberation with Congress result in better policymaking?
In some instances, a faster plan is better than a better plan deliberated out. In the words of General Patton, a good plan violently executed is better than a perfect plan executed next week. The realities of modern warfare are such that escalations which once required months of intense planning, such as those in Vietnam, have been supplanted by those which take place in minutes. Only a president who is fully empowered as the commander-in-chief to order troops into combat without being hamstrung by an overly deliberative or even perhaps contentious Congress can save lives. Crises such as the Achilles Lauro, the Maersk, Alabama, and the kidnapping of Jessica Buchanan are just some examples of when the ability of the presidents to order military action without binding consultation of Congress was critical. It is possible that Congress could have aided the president in coming up with a better plan in all or many of these situations. Of course, it is also possible that in the time taken to convince Congress to act at all, more American lives would have been lost, definitely. We think that the loss of American lives outweigh the need for congressional deliberations. Thank you again for your time and attention of this topic.
Thank you, Natasha. Ian Lee is next, delivering the fourth affirmative speech.
This debate is extremely relative to today's current political climate. If put into law, Obama would have to consult with Congress over matters of significant armed conflict. We should look to history as to whether or not this law should be passed and turned from legislature into an actual law that would be under judicial review. Our opponents talk a lot about presidential powers and how we need to preserve them. We are not here to say that we are taking away the law or that we are changing the law. We are here maintaining that we preserve the presidential power to still act as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, while still consulting with Congress to do so. Under no certain environment would these laws constrain the president to act in expedited measures. That is when Section 3B of the War Powers Consultation Act is for. So he can immediately act and then answer to Congress after 3 days of those actions. It's important that we look to history as to whether or not we should put this law into effect. Of the 136 reports filed under the War Powers Resolution, only one of them filed Section 4A1, specifically stipulating that the president is sending armed forces into imminent hostilities. The one time it was actually reported was in 1975, 2 years after passage, when Ford sent a memo to 5 congressional members to overtake the SS Mayaguez, which was retaken by Cambodian rebels. However, the action was filed to Congress, only notifying them after they had already retaken the cruise ship, and it only took 5 days to actually succeed in their mission. It was simply a good grace gesture that put us on a bad path toward the president usurping his powers of war. I'd like to take your question.
Yes, so the bill changes the definition of hostilities that the president uses when determining an exemption. And I'm wondering what prevents the president from construing a threat however necessary in order to meet that definition?
Sure. The significant armed conflict definition is much more concise and definitive than the current definition of imminent hostilities in the War Powers Resolution. Not only do we say that the president can only act and only send troops into a significant armed conflict when he has to consult Congress, it defines significant armed conflict as only being one of two things. It's either expected to last longer than a week, or it was an act that was declared as an act of war of Congress. Only these two things are declared as significant armed conflicts. We can also look to examples of how presidents have gotten out of consulting Congress because of the lack of definition of imminent hostility. Reagan sent forces into Lebanon in 1982. He didn't cite Section 4A1, which didn't trigger the 60 to 90-day limit. He also said that they were not in imminent harm because no Marines were dying. However, after Marines started dying, he said no more were going to die, so they're still not in imminent harm. This lasted for 60 days until Congress finally filed suit against the president. However, after he sent thousands of Marines there, and he had already consulted Congress, they were already there. So Congress said, we'll cut our losses. You have to get them out in a year and a half. It was a prime example of how the president was allowed to usurp his powers and go into a war that was not favored by either Congress or public policy. Moreover, we can look to the current Libya example, which only occurred 2 years ago. Obama invaded Libya in 2011 without consulting Congress. He cited it as an expedited procedure under NATO. Thus, he didn't need to consult. He also said that they would be out of there after 60 days. So since they would be out of there, he didn't need to consult. After the 60 days were up, he didn't ask Congress for a 30-day extension, which is in the WPR. He didn't ask, moreover, he didn't even pull out of Libya. What he did is he handed over the control of the United States forces to NATO, allowing them to control them, as there's still some forces actually over there currently in Libya under NATO. These are two prime examples of how the United States federal government needs to intervene and to how we need to have the president under judicial review and make it law. Like my teammate from George Washington stipulated earlier, the problem is that the president is not held accountable under law. However, this piece of legislation specifically stipulates that no treaties override this law, and the president must be held accountable to congressional approval. The reason that the judicial has been skeptical as to whether or not pursue any legal action against the president is because of the lack of definition of imminent hostilities and consultation within the War Powers Resolution. It is only with concise definitions and concise resolution within Congress and within this piece of legislation that we can actually save lives in the long run. Thus, in conclusion, all laws have inherent problems and loopholes, but we should at least try to preserve and reduce the amount of loopholes inherent in each law. And the War Powers Consultation Act is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Closing out this portion of the negative side is Midshipman Jacob Kotlarski from the Naval Academy.
Again, I would like to remind everyone that we do not speak tonight on behalf of the U.S. military or the Department of Defense. We are advancing arguments on one side of the war powers debate, nothing more and nothing less. It seems that the heart of this issue in tonight's debate is one of flexibility. Our position is that the current War Powers Act gives Congress the ability to weigh in on presidential decision-making and to authorize actual wars. However, it allows the president the leeway and authority to engage in smaller, more targeted military operations without involving Congress, unless he chooses to do so. As we have seen, the president can always choose to involve Congress in military decision-making and will likely do so when the issue is contentious. We only take issue with the idea that the president should be required to consult Congress over the escalation that may or may not happen during already existing military conflicts, as we referenced in our first speech. As our colleagues from James Madison noted, the founders reserved the commander-in-chief powers to the president for a reason. Vesting decision-making powers in a single person is preferable in the heat of war to the slow, deliberative power that defines Congress. In most instances, slow decision-making and even gridlock can be good because it prevents the law from getting carried away by the heat of passion. We respect the value of deliberation in modern society. However, in times of war, when decisions are being made that put lives at risk, orders cannot be issued by committees. Warfare is a matter of ready, aim, fire, not a matter of ready, aim, wait. Did Congress approve this yet? The legislative branch was intended by the founders to be the saucer to the teacup, not the trigger lock to our weapons. Yes, sir.
You first state that the president has exclusive war powers authority. That's factually inaccurate. Congress also has the ability to declare war. And you also say that the framers set up the government to be slow and deliberative. Why wouldn't they agree with the War Powers Consultation Act if that's true?
That preference doesn't extend into the modern era for a few reasons. One, the framers also didn't want us to have a standing army or navy, which we obviously have now. The development of a huge military has obviously also increased the power of the commander-in-chief of the military. Two, the framers didn't want us to get involved in entangling alliances, such as those we have with NATO, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Israel. Given that those alliances are key to our hegemony and our national security, I'd say the framers' preference in this area doesn't fully grasp the complexity of the modern world. We are also concerned that political differences, such as the government divided between Democrats and Republicans, could lead to squabbles between the executive branch and the legislative branch, which would hamper our national security and prevent us from getting involved in conflicts critical to our national interests. Congress already has the ability to do so via the power of the purse, but generally will not intervene to defund existing conflicts due to concerns over the lives and conditions of troops already deployed. However, to give power to Congress prior to any military engagement allows Congress to play politics with our national security in an unprecedented and frankly dangerous way. Critical national security interests should not be held hostage to domestic political concerns. Yes, sir.
You seem to be advancing the argument pretty strongly that the president needs to have unfettered ability to declare war. What role, if any, do you think Congress should play in the process?
We do not, of course, imply that the president acts alone. In these matters, he is advised by the National Security Council, led by the National Security Advisor, as well as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The president also receives advice from many other people, from his dedicated advisors to citizens of the country. We do, however, mean that the president must be the sole person issuing orders to avoid confusion and gridlock, which could cause the loss of lives, especially in the modern era of warfare, when strategic consequences can happen in an instant. Who knows how many incidents can happen within 30 days' time? We further concur with our colleagues that Congress and the courts will be politically unwilling to enforce the new requirements, and that many of the restrictions would be meaningless. But frankly, toothlessness is not our worry. If the worst that could be said of binding the president to answer to Congress in all military engagements is that it would not be enforced, we would be less concerned. Our concern is that, even if Congress and the courts would not constrain the president to ask permission, the president would feel so bound, which would chill his willingness and ability to act to save lives and preserve the national interest as he is constitutionally bound to do. Thank you for your time and attention to this matter.
Thank you, Jacob. We're getting close to the end. The next round of speeches will be between debaters from the University of Mary Washington and Georgetown University. Mariah Young of the University of Mary Washington will lead off with the fifth affirmative speech.
Good evening. Anyone watching the news would know that the situation going on in Syria is constantly evolving. We believe this ongoing situation speaks well to the critical need for the War Powers Consultation Act. The change of events that have occurred, such as their consideration of turning weapons over to international control, show that deliberation is an important aspect in wartime decision-making. While both James Madison and the Naval Academy have made some well-intended points, we believe that they miss the crucial benefit of the War Powers Consultation Act. I first intend to discuss why the War Powers Resolution has failed us as a nation, then prove that the War Powers Consultation Act is more beneficial due to the deliberation and accountability that would take place. And finally, I will address the opposing team's arguments about the president's flexibility. There are no instances in which the War Powers Resolution has been strictly followed. When the bill was constructed in the 70s, it was seen as hasty and a simple compromise. Establishing a framework for when different contexts emerge is critical. We should not rely on a rigid set of procedures that have not been implemented. They have continuously been ignored. With the War Powers Consultation Act, there will already be a functioning guide from which decisions can be made. In the National War Powers Commission's report, it is said that even ardent advocates of congressional power recognize that Section 2C of the resolution too narrowly defines the president's war powers, and many agree that it has been regularly breached. Since the enactment of the resolution, presidents have sent troops into conflict on several occasions when none of these circumstances were present, including Grenada, Yugoslavia, and Haiti. James Madison University argues that the president will ignore the consultation and act unilaterally. Section 4B of the Act specifically says that before ordering the deployment of the United States Armed Forces in a significant armed conflict, the president shall consult with the Joint Congressional Consultation Committee. This act isn't simply something the president can just choose to do, it has to be done. The report says that the president will provide an opportunity for the timely exchange of views. The president cannot notify the consultation committee that significant armed conflict has already been initiated. This process will ensure better dialogue. According to the National War Powers Commission report, there will be greater opportunities and incentives for the president and Congress to engage in meaningful consultation. The Joint Congressional Consultation Committee, which the Act creates, provides such a vehicle. The statute also provides clear mechanisms by which Congress can state its support or disapproval of the significant armed conflicts. Yes.
How much time does obtaining congressional approval add on to or possibly hinder the operation?
I think it's important to say that we can't specifically say how long it would take. Depending on the situation, that time would probably differ. But to provide context for the act, the President Reagan's limited airstrikes against Libya would not count as a significant armed conflict. The 2 Iraq wars would be considered a significant armed conflict. And the United States campaign in Bosnia in the 90s would also count as significant armed conflicts. As our colleagues from George Washington and Pittsburgh have touched on, the War Powers Consultation Act allows for more cooperation between our branches of government. It gives more flexibility to the president and allows for more legislative power when it comes to wartime decision-making. As former Secretary Baker said, the act gives the legislative branch more by way of a meaningful consultation and information. It also provides Congress a clear and simple mechanism by which to approve or disapprove a military's campaign, and does so in a way that seeks to avoid the constitutional infirmities that plague the War Powers Resolution. The act works to give Congress a seat at the table. It gives the president the benefit of Congress's counsel, and it provides a mechanism for the president and the public to know Congress's views before or as a military campaign begins. History suggests that building broad-based support for a military campaign from both branches of government and the public is often vital for success. While the negative team argues that the potential gridlock would slow down the ability to get the bill passed, the president would still be able to use military action if it is an extreme circumstance, resulting in later approval by the Consultation Commission. Getting this approval from Congress is key to bolstering our foreign appearance. A weak and disagreeing country does not look as effective and strong as a nation that can agree on a war plan, a plan to better our world. We do not believe that the president should lose power or flexibility in deciding our military actions, but instead all parties should have responsibility in deciding the factors at play. Congress is the first in line when it comes to the representation of the public. Allowing Congress to consider their constituents is an important aspect of being a democracy. Every voice should be heard. The decision to go to war should not be taken lightly. Congress should no longer be able to sit on the sideline and not face the repercussions of going to war. The War Powers Consultation Act will allow for better cooperation and responsibility for large decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah. Georgetown's R-Ariz is next with a negative argument.
Do we want big workarounds and flexibility or binding requirements? The bill doesn't know which way it wants it, and our opponents have not explained how we can possibly have it both ways under their interpretation of the Constitution. The workarounds contained in this bill for extenuating circumstances aren't a fail-safe. They're a recipe for failure. Exemptions for imminent threats and terrorism can be construed to encompass nearly all U.S. military action today. In fact, it is this precise definitions debate about what constitutes an imminent threat that has baffled constitutional scholars discussing the issue of military force for more than 10 years. Our opponents say all time-sensitive issues. In war, we believe that's code for all issues. The definitional problems I've just articulated circumscribe the scope of the consultation requirement. So the usefulness of consultation is hampered by these workarounds just as much as the rest of the bill. Every example in my opponent's last speech is a reason that this law will become another hoop to jump through and not a durable constraint. Yes, sir.
You claim that all issues of war are time sensitive. What about our invasion of Iraq or the potential of airstrikes in Syria? Are those time sensitive issues as well?
In response to that question, I would ask another question, which is, what grounds does the affirmative purport to claim to contest the commander-in-chief's definition and characterization of what is or is not an imminent threat? So there is different time sensitiveness. That's why the president gets to make those determinations. The bill can't stop that either way. The forms of congressional recourse that are cited in this report, the power of the purse and impeachment, take a really long time. Putting aside the political barriers to achieving either of those outcomes, here's the time frame I envision. Hostilities begin. The president notifies Congress. Congress votes against the use of force 30 days later, or let's say less if they all agree. Then Congress begins to move to restrict funding. In the time that each of these steps has taken place, hostilities will be active and ongoing. A good example is the use of military force by Abraham Lincoln. I know it's an old example, but it works. In response to the Battle of Fort Sumter, Congress retroactively approved nearly everything that Lincoln did. But let's be realistic. Once the war started, they basically had no choice. Our opponents speak to the importance of broad-based public support. Syria, the public support related to it, all of this is developing and ongoing. There are new polls every day, and they're fluctuating by as much as 40 points. That's not durable constitutional consensus. Finally, the broader constitutional question that is presented by the war powers dispute is left unresolved by this bill. The proposed legislation has an explicit provision that prevents the bill from being construed in a way that would hinder the constitutional powers of either branch, but the whole dispute in the first place is about what the two branches think of the way that they can assert those powers in real time. Finally, the WPR, this updated WPR, enshrines the ability of workarounds and fixes nothing. Hoops to jump through create a masking effect for legitimacy, which makes that constitutional support, that public support, less credible. Yes?
Why doesn't the up or down vote given to Congress solve problems with the War Powers Resolution?
That's a really good question. The fact that this bill forces a vote does not mean that that vote, that resolution, has teeth. We have the opportunity to engage in resolutions now. By leaving the forces in place that rendered the WPR ineffective, that vote could just as easily become a rubber stamp. It's still, as I would call it, a post hoc solution to a real-time problem. And as our colleagues from the Naval Academy have so articulately stated, real-time problems make all of the difference on these issues of national importance. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andre. We are now in the final arguments. Please remember that these final two speeches will be 4 minutes and will remain uninterrupted. Delivering the sixth and final affirmative speech is Tom Pacheco from Mary Washington.
This debate amounts to 3 questions: the effectiveness of the War Powers Resolution, the effectiveness of the War Powers Consultation Act, and the flexibility that the president needs in order to conduct foreign policy. There is no debate that the War Powers Resolution has been ineffective. First, no president has ever followed it, which denigrates the rule of law. Second, the War Powers Resolution permits congressional inaction, which creates discord within the government during times of war. Third, it means that the voice of one person determines whether the United States goes to war or not, which leaves too much discretion with the president. If you agree that the War Powers Resolution is insufficient policy, then you should agree with our side in this debate. Our opponents must disprove the need for reform, and if they cannot, then reform is the only hope for better execution of foreign policy. The War Powers Consultation Act has been built upon bipartisan, comprehensive scholarly research, including personal contributions from 2 different secretaries of state. The act creates a commission exclusively for the purpose of communicating with the president over foreign policy, particularly in times of war. The act institutionalizes consultation, which creates harmony between the president and Congress in foreign policy. The War Powers Consultation Act forces the Consultation Committee to bring forth resolutions in order to authorize or curtail the war effort within 30 days of presidential consultation. Most of our opponents' arguments do not assume this because it directly changes the president's calculations when determining to go to war or not, because they know that Congress has to either approve or disapprove of it. That does not exist now. This also allows for more voices and representatives of the United States to be heard in the decision-making process. Democracy may not be fast, but it is beautiful when it works. As FDR proclaimed after Congress authorized U.S. entry into World War II, the decision of democracy may be slowly arrived at, but when that decision is made, it is made not by the voice of one, but by the voice of 130 million. It also means that Congress cannot flip-flop on supporting or criticizing the war. This means that the government acts with one voice in foreign policy. The president has the least flexibility to execute war and foreign policy when conducting a war that Congress openly criticizes without being bound to an opinion. William Howe, a University of Chicago political scientist, says, members of Congress can use hearings, debates, and media appearances to make the case that a military venture failed. As occurred at the latter stages of Vietnam, this may lay the groundwork for legislative action against the president. But even in the absence of a formal rebuke, congressional criticisms can turn the public against the president, signal to U.S. allies and enemies a lack of resolve for continued military action, and upend congressional action on other aspects of the president's congressional agenda. It is also critical for our troops to have a consensus with the government, as Senator Kaine mentioned at length. Likewise, the president has the greatest flexibility in foreign policy when Congress and the president agree. Justice Jackson explained that the president's authority is at its zenith when the president is acting within express congressional authorization. There's only a risk that greater deliberation between the president and Congress in an institutionalized form results in more prudent decision-making instead of imperial wars. The constitutional division of authority of the war powers is an unsettled question. Georgetown is correct about this. What good policy will do is strike a balance between flexibility in executing foreign policy while maintaining democratic foreign policy. The War Powers Consultation Act optimizes foreign policy in a bipartisan and informed way. Therefore, the War Powers Consultation Act should be implemented.
Thank you, Tom. Georgetown's Andrew Markoff will deliver the final speech of the evening in opposition to the resolution.
There are a few things to keep in mind when synthesizing all the arguments you've heard. First, is it possible to have an effective restriction on the president's war powers? We've consistently argued no. The distinction at the beginning of Mary Washington's last speech between the War Powers Resolution and the WPCA is flawed. We've argued that both have created massive carve-outs for the president to be able to issue not issue a declaration of war, but to go to war whenever he so pleases. Keep in mind two things. One, Congress has no political incentive to enforce constraints on the president's war powers, especially during a time of crisis. Think about September 11th and the authorization for the use of military force. 2 wars begun with massive public support by the president. Second, Congress will rubber stamp the president basically any of these times. Think about intervention in Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War because of opposition to communism and fear of red spread. The executive also has no interest in complying. Think about when Congress asked not even for consultation, but for information about CIA torture. The CIA would rather destroy documents than comply
with any sort of congressional oversight. Or think about President Reagan. When Congress banned funding for the Contras, President Reagan used the White House budget to put that funding through the National Security Council. Let's say there's a dispute and it goes to the court. The courts have consistently ruled that they cannot rule on questions that are inherently political, such as going to war. Specifically, is the WPCA effective? We've argued that there are multiple flaws. It only requires consultation before a significant armed conflict, expected to last more than 1 week. Think about how the president would approach these issues. A quick airstrike on Syria, the quick airstrike on Kosovo. How about a small intervention, like our intervention in Somalia? Can we expect that some of those could credibly end within a week? We think so. What about funding another armed group like the Contras? What about drones? What does the WPCA do about something with an indefinite amount of time attached to it, or some sort of intervention? Finally, what we've argued is that the president can still point to his constitutional authority to use force because the act explicitly states that it is not meant to define the constitutional war powers of the executive or legislative branches. That means that every argument the president uses now to use unilateral military force would still be in effect. The fact that we can even have a debate about whether the Syria or the Libya conflicts qualify as significant armed conflicts proves that workarounds are easy. The president just needs to deploy his lawyers to argue in favor of that, and the courts will support the president. The specific broad carve-outs of the WPCA for reprisals against terrorists and covert operations, keep in mind, includes the ongoing war against al-Qaeda and all of its global affiliates, which we don't even know how far that allows the president to stretch his power. Mary Washington asserts that it will change the president's calculation, but we've argued that it won't. And if the president is constrained, you should think back to the Israel escalation example of Syria. Would that be good? Do we need to act on one voice, or act with one voice, or act in response to conflict? The one voice argument doesn't even make that much sense. Think about current partisanship. When is the last time America has acted with one voice on anything? If you believe that there is some amount of constraint, and we think that is highly unlikely because of the WPCA, when would it kick in? If the president did have uncertainty about whether he could use military force, that creates gigantic potential crisis situations. And we think that is not worth the risk for a very small benefit of not even really fundamentally changing the balance of powers between Congress and the president. It's very clear that the act does not do much, and what it does is only dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the debate portion of the evening. Listening to these young women and men engage in such a thoughtful civil debate about a topic as complex as war powers, I think should reassure all of us that the future of the Republic is indeed in good hands. Please join me in thanking them for their contribution to this important national conversation. We will now give the audience a chance to weigh in with some questions. I think we have a microphone being placed in the middle aisle. Let me open the floor now to questions from the audience. Who's first? We have time for a few questions. Please come to the microphone and we'll recognize you. Please make it a question and not a speech.
I was wondering what the War Powers Resolution Act would do in a scenario where Congress is out of session and it does not fall into the requirements met under Section 3 to respond to a war.
Well, it doesn't have any specific specifications about whether or not Congress will have to come back to session. It does say that it will be the immediate business of Congress and the Senate, and I think that's open to a little bit of interpretation. But on something that's a very pressing issue, I think they would reconvene for that, and it would become their immediate business, is what the legislation says.
The current Syria issue provides some context to this issue. When Obama made a speech about Syria, it was actually Labor Day weekend. A number of committee members came back to discuss what they would do as soon as Congress met formally on September 9th. Despite Congress only meeting on September 9th, a number of legislators, and I'm sure Senator Kaine's staff can attest to this, were here long before then deciding what they would do once Congress is formally back meeting.
Thank you. Next question.
I don't know who wants to take this, but someone brought up the quote by General Patton. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. And for whoever wants to answer it, I would ask, do you believe that's different than the thinking that got us entangled in Vietnam and then Iraq and Afghanistan?
Which side do you want to direct that question?
I guess I'll direct it towards this side, but whoever wants to take it.
I don't know, I have such problems with microphones. I think it just depends on the circumstances. Like some events, you need a plan right away. Sometimes it might not be the right plan, but when American lives are at risk, then an immediate action should be taken. And that's what I was referring to when I quoted General Patton with like these issues where American lives were at jeopardy, and it was under time constraint. So.
Thank you.
Keeping in mind
Next
also,
question. Yeah,
it's
go
also
ahead.
keeping in mind that every example you listed had overwhelming broad bipartisan support at the beginning of a war. So the idea that additional oversight would change those decisions that may have been bad in retrospect from happening seems questionable.
Thank you. Next question.
So the opposition has largely made the argument that the president needs unconstrained powers when it comes to actions of war, largely because of the dangers that presents. And yet in this new resolution, it clearly gives exemptions to when there's imminent threats or the such to the United States. So my question to you is, if your belief is that we largely need a president unrestricted by the legislature in terms of acts, and yet we look at the president's wartime powers in the post-9/11 world, specifically when we see in 2009 the Obama administration released a report specifying dozens of abuses under the Bush administration when the government using their authority granted to them by Congress and also not granted by Congress, engaging in acts such as waterboarding, which the United States prosecuted Japanese prisoners of war after World War II for doing these to American prisoners of war. Wouldn't you say that even if this isn't a perfect resolution, the legislature needs to take a much greater step in oversight in the president's wartime powers?
I think our argument dealing with presidential flexibility specifically deals with issues of national security, right? Like if there's going to be some organization that might try to attack us or our citizens abroad or in the United States, I think it's key that we have a quick decision without congressional oversight to protect our national security interests.
Thank you.
And if I may, I think one other thing to keep in mind is that even if it is true that there are significant abuses that have resulted by invoking the logic of imminent threat and national security, there's also a question of political momentum and political will. Given that this legislation doesn't actually prevent the abuses that you've mentioned, and given that it is extremely arduous task to get any legislation passed at all, that means that it's extremely unlikely if this bill were to be debated in Congress and then passed that we would see any kind of substantive reform anytime soon. So while that may be true, it's a question of whether or not the time, focus, and resources of Congress should be invested on this law now instead of a future piece of legislation.
Okay, next question. Thank you.
Yes, hi. First, a disclaimer. I was a guest lecturer at the Naval Academy this morning, giving a lecture on this very topic. I'm glad to hear it today, and you're all doing an excellent job. I just have a question with respect to the affirmative in terms of the judicial reviewability of the Consultation Act here, because, as you rightly stated, the courts have assiduously avoided adjudicating anything under the War Powers Resolution because of a political question in terms of deciding what is hostilities and what is consultation. It seems to me that the consultation statute doesn't really do much more in terms of defining significant conflict here. There's a lot of loopholes and what is combat operations for a week. If there's a ceasefire after 7 days and then it's reinstituted, does the clock start again? And also consultation. There's really no definition there any more than there's a definition in the War Powers Resolution, what that entails. So how would you maintain that the courts could even begin to adjudicate this, and even if they could, there's a timeliness problem about them acting and ordering the president to what? That he committed a violation of this act and then he gets impeached, or how would that result?
Well, I'm not sure the courts would get involved, but a lot of these things do exist within the act, and there are time constraints and everything, so we didn't get a chance to debate them fully out. But the War Powers Consultation Act does define what a consultation would constitute. The president is supposed to inform Congress of the evidence that they have for why the United States should go to war, and it is a non-binding consultation, which means even if the committee does not agree with the president's decision to go to war, it does not necessarily constrain the president. But the idea of the consultation is to give the president a gauge on the political climate for authorizing war, because what the act sets in place is an up or down vote within 30 days. Right now, under the War Powers Resolution, Congress does not have to do anything. They have to hit the clock to determine whether or not troops will be withdrawn. After the act, they're much more likely to vote no to war because the committee draws up the yes or no vote and the authorization. So the president would have to take that into account, which makes it much more likely that they would not necessarily go to war. And you also mentioned the shift, like if there's a ceasefire and then the ceasefire's broken. Any change in mission status, so if the ceasefire was broken, would require reauthorization according to the act.
Next question.
An individual from Mary Washington said that the president's consultation with Congress does help maintain a democratic foreign policy. Congress was created to represent the American people. Is it not only appropriate that the American people do, at least by some extent, have some input into whether or not we go to war?
The main thing that our whole team, the whole negative was stating, was the matter of flexibility. It's not a matter of does the president do these choices on his own or not. It's a matter of he has the option to if it's necessary. What this new resolution would be, it would pretty much be mandatory that he confers with Congress under any situation that requires more than a week. So we tried to present scenarios in which it was still important that the president could act on his own if necessary. My partner tried to use the idea that 1,000 minds conferring, I believe, so many minds conferring will take so much time, but one quick decision can always come in handy.
Thank you. Next question.
The opposition argues that the act is ineffective but does not offer a comprehensive solution. So what would be specific points that the opposition would say would solve or improve the war powers in the country?
I think my partner was really good about mentioning that passing this bill would make it seem like we're solving the war powers problem, which would then prevent legislation that might actually change something from being passed. So it's sort of like a mask, making us think, oh, well, everyone's talking, so everything's going to be okay. Instead, further on, when we figure out how we actually can handle this, a real bill could be passed to create change.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Monica Dokoy, and I worked for a long time at the World Bank and IMF. But I'm a PhD in political science, so I get to teach many of those courses and on war. And my question to you is, we were dealing this week with Syria, and ultimately, decision, I think there were just I teach, so I'm kind of thinking, how the approach was of the administration. And I think the administration made a mistake because they went all out, we are going to go for a strike. They did not reach the Arabs. When they reached out, for example, to Israel, Egypt, everybody around said, no, we don't want more wars. And so when you think in terms of that, and then it was Ban Ki-moon, this is very interesting, in New York, and he was Obama convinced him there has to be some sort of action. And Samantha Powers they were ready for it. But ultimately, there was one argument who won the day was the Russian, Vladimir Putin's, right before the G20. And he said, look, Assad did genocide or killed hundreds of thousands, whatever, dozens, whatever, of people. However, he did not do an act of war. So structurally, the Congress and the president and also Ban Ki-moon at UN is, the question they have is there's so much conflict around the world, where do you intervene? And it's imminent national security, but structurally, basically the Russians said, if it's not an act of war, in other words, Assad did not do an act of war, basically you cannot strike him back. So this was actually I think Boehner, the Republicans turned against, and that's why they are giving right now hard time to Obama. Although Kerry and now Kerry goes around the world, but at G20, just to give you an idea, look at the movement. At G20, Ban Ki-moon and actually the Russians got the international coalition. What we were actually arguing was them to get the Arabs, and all the Arabs said no intervention. So Kerry actually is trying right now to get the support of Arabs, but I think that there's almost like a peak also when you see the war is not equal. In all times you intervene. So this is a bit too long, what I'm saying, just to give you an idea a bit how I'm thinking of this, because I think it's structurally and reflects. My question to you is actually, when do you end a war and how do you end it? It can be a declaration, and if you think throughout the history, what does it mean? It's very, because what does it mean in Afghanistan? What does it mean, in Iraq? So I used to work in Iraq in Basra, in the southern part.
Right, the question is, how does a war end? Who wants to take that?
Thank you. And I apologize for I generally
okay,
don't
thank you.
Well, from a constitutional perspective, the thing that we struggled with a lot in this debate was, what can a piece of legislation do about the congressional authority to declare war versus commander-in-chief power? And something that the negative was attempting to prove was that those two forces written into the Constitution are durable because of the very ambiguity you cite in defining a war. When does it begin? When does it end? Do the American people support a 4-day war but not a 7-day war? And does that difference matter? So I would imagine that, as far as the cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal for the authorization for using military force is concerned, that is both a simpler question because of commander-in-chief power, but a more difficult question because it's based on the circumstances on the ground.
Yes, next question.
My question is to the affirmative. Now, this resolution specifically states that if there's an imminent threat to the United States, that this resolution is essentially void and the president can act as he chooses. Yet in the current policy of drone warfare, technically the United States only engages in our activities of drone warfare against targets that we consider posing an imminent threat to the United States. And yet it's overwhelmingly clear that this program has been used to target people that when we simply view it as more convenient than sending in ground troops. Furthermore, the administration expanded their view of imminent threat to say anyone planning an attack against the United States would be considered an imminent threat to national security. So giving this overwhelmingly expansive view of anyone planning any activities that could harm the United States as now posing an imminent threat to our national security, couldn't any enemy of the United States perceivably be construed to pose an imminent threat? And thus this resolution does nothing to constrain the president's ability to act militarily, but may even embolden him to do so more?
Well, this resolution would not necessarily have many ways to alter previous authorizations of war by Congress. So a lot of what you cite about drones stems from the 2001 authorization of the use of military force, in which Congress gave the president a lot of leeway and did not very clearly define a lot of words within the act, which allows the president to interpret imminent threats in certain ways that might allow for him to strike people who might be planning an attack, per se. To be clear, imminent threat is not a part of the War Powers Consultation Act. What constitutes a significant armed conflict is something which will last over a week. So the dangers of imminent threat are not really imposed by this bill in particular, but this bill would also not necessarily override the 2001 AUMF.
Next question.
Good evening. It was a pleasure listening to you all debate, and I have two questions. Is the War Powers Resolution truly unconstitutional? And if it is, why hasn't the Supreme Court deemed it so and had it nullified?
Interesting question. It's debatable as to whether or not it's constitutional or unconstitutional. That can really only be determined by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will not weigh in on this. They have a doctrine of deference when it comes to political questions. And what that means essentially is questions that are political belong to the political branches. And so Congress or the executive are the ones who determine war, not the judiciary. So the Supreme Court has been very reluctant to step in instances of war to determine whether or not something is constitutional. So unless they were to do that, we wouldn't have a clear-cut answer. Because they haven't, we don't. And the political question doctrine is the reason why they don't. It's been built up over hundreds of years.
We will conclude the round of questionings with those people standing at the microphone, and then we will conclude.
Can I ask two questions?
Yes.
All right.
Go ahead.
So to the affirmative, you stated that the justification for drone warfare was the 2001 authorization for the use of force, but that only authorized the use of force within Afghanistan and Iraq, and yet the three largest battlefields for drone warfare have been Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, which in no way has Congress authorized any use of force whatsoever in these three nations. Furthermore, several months ago when Obama outlined his plans for drone warfare, he stated that he wanted to move it from a program run by the CIA to a program under the Department of Defense. So would this mean that every strike undertaken by the executive would first need congressional approval, specifically if a drone is going to be monitoring over another country for a period of over 7 days? And if not, how do you differentiate between things such as drone warfare and more conventional means of warfare, specifically when Congress hasn't authorized any use of force whatsoever in these nations?
I think that goes back to the question of the redefinition, since hostilities is not defined in the WPR. I think that a drone, it is, I guess, conceivable that there would be an only drone war, but a specific drone strike does not take very much time at all. Obviously, they're very fast. It's a surgical strike. They get it done and leave. So that would not constitute the kind of hostilities that the WPCA would restrict. No, it would not have any bearing on that question.
And my second question to you is that your opposition has largely made the claim that the problem with war in the United States is a political issue and not a legal issue. So, for example, the Bush Office of Legal Counsel stated that prisoners of war captured in Afghanistan and Iraq could suffer sustained isolation, sleep deprivation, forced nudity, prolonged exposure to the cold, dietary manipulation, stress positioning, and the most infamous crime of all under the Bush administration, waterboarding. The Bush administration justified this by saying that under the Geneva III conventions, that these people weren't actually prisoners of war, but simply enemy combatants. Yet despite this, President Ronald Reagan signed and the Senate ratified the Convention Against Torture Treaty, which explicitly prohibits these sorts of measures. Furthermore, it states that clauses such as threats to national security or an order from a commanding officer can't be used to engage such as torture. The State Department criticized other nations for using these methods such as torture, and Article 6 of our Constitution specifically enshrines the rule of law when it comes to treaties. This was a treaty signed by the President and ratified by Congress, yet there have been little to no congressional oversight to these abuses by the executive. Not a single person has been held accountable, and under this treaty ratified by the Senate, it is a crime of the United States and of our legislature to not actively engage in research and hold accountable those who did it. So when Congress is unable to take response to some things like this, things that which have been widely documented as abuse, which have been reported by our media and the executive branch itself, what makes you think that they'll have the political will to deal with these issues of war, as your opponent has stated, which is that this problem is political and not legal?
Well, that was part of what I dealt with at the very top of my speech, saying that a lot of the arguments that the negative was advancing were about taking political will versus what the act actually changes. You understand that a lot of the things you say, they've both responded are under an error in defining hostilities. The act would make it such that the consultation that should happen, regardless of whether or not the Constitution and Congress is going to hold the president accountable, is a more effective means of consultation. the JCCC would have better intelligence about drone strikes, about the types of torture that is being used, and be independent counsel for if the president is going to consult them in the future. That is why the political will arguments, you're right, are rightfully ambiguous, but the act doesn't necessarily make anyone more willing, right? It just makes it so that the consultation that should occur occurs in a better forum.
Final question.
Hi. Living in a democracy, we have the advantages of, and living in a democracy and having the advantages of technology disseminating information to the public, we have the advantage of knowing the ongoings of our governmental institutions. It also grants the same advantage to our adversaries. I personally understand the importance of time in military strategy and operations. How do you define the time allowed for congressional banter, allowing our adversaries the same amount of time for preparation in defense, and does not limit our cost and benefit calculation estimates by revealing military secrets or at least the ability for first strike advantage?
This was an issue that was actually raised in the debate a couple of times. There are a few exemptions in which consultation would not be necessary, and things like covert operations are included under that general header. So in any time in which it would be necessary for us to respond to a strike or act with time sensitivity, the president will still have that flexibility after passage of the WPCA, and he does have it now. It's just the act doesn't do anything to hamper his ability to act when it's necessary to act in time-sensitive situations.
Thank you very much. To the audience, I want to thank you for your questions and participation in tonight's debate. To the debaters, I want to thank you again for your deepening our understanding of this important topic, and I hope that at least some of you will consider a career in public service. Having worked at the University of Virginia for the last 7 years, it's become second nature to quote our founder, Thomas Jefferson. In fact, last time I looked, it might even be in my contract. But in this instance, Thomas Jefferson's words seem to be somewhat appropriate. He said, "We abhor the follies of war and are not untried in its distresses and calamities." Unfortunately, we sometimes fail to understand the implications of such a warning, but I hope the reasoned arguments by the students tonight on both sides of the resolution will teach us all how to understand and avoid that fate in the future. Let me advise you that the next debate in this series will be Friday, November the 8th at 10:30 a.m. in the Reagan Presidential Library in Scenic Valley, California. You may want to book your flights and arrange your plans now. To find more information on this and future debates in this series, including full debate video, go to the Miller Center website, www.millercenter.org, or the CETA website, www.cetadebate.org. You can also find additional materials on the National War Powers Commission on the Miller Center's webpage. Once again, our special thanks to Senator Kaine for his participation tonight. On behalf of the Miller Center, the Cross-Examination Debate Association, and George Washington University, thank you all, and good night.